Welcome back to FanCAStic for episode 12. So, in the previous podcast, we discussed the need and the differences between support and autonomy in order to set up CAS leaders for success. Now, we're going to take a deeper dive into what really sets CAS leaders up for success beyond support and autonomy. And we are going to we're going to talk about growth, we're going to talk about M&A, we're going to talk about what Christine calls the honeymoon stall, marketing, business development gaps, tech governance, all of the practical, specific things that we need to talk about. And this discussion is going to be led by our resident CAS expert, Christine Triantos. Hi, Christine.
Kristy. Yeah, I'm excited about this. I'm again passionate about firms' success within CAS and passionate about CAS leaders and are we setting them up for success?
So,
So,
are you ready to get practical and specific?
yeah, let's go.
Okay. Well, I want to jump into M&A because it's everywhere. I mean, more and more we see firms being acquired, acquiring firms. I mean, what's actually happening on the ground and how is this activity impacting CAS leaders, specifically when a firm acquires a CAS practice, which you've told me before oftentimes turns out to be a write-up practice.
Right. Yeah, and I mean it's so popular right now, right? Like every
Hmm.
firm is acquiring another firm, so you're the acquiree or the acquirer, right? So, with the acquirers, what we see is that they're often, they let newly acquired firms run autonomously, in that honeymoon period because they want to come in and just, um, for lack of a better word, be nice, right? And they want them, they want to avoid disruption. They're not trying to do that. It feels courteous. It feels nice. Let's just let them do what they need to do without impacting them too much. But what ends up happening is, a lot of the acquired firms actually want more change than they're getting upfront. They come in expecting, oh my gosh, we're being acquired. They're going to have all of these fantastic processes. Everything's just going to be so masterfully standardized and ready to basically plug and play. And then, they're thinking, we'll have access to the processes and the resources but instead, that's often a disconnect, right? And so autonomy is granted in those cases, but there's generally not a full onboarding roadmap with clear expectations and shared goals. And what does that mean for everybody on both sides? And when you don't have that, then both sides have different expectations and maybe different, you know, disappointments within that.
Well, let's also layer time on that because, I don't think there's really a good time to go through an acquisition, especially when you consider that CAS isn't seasonal. I mean, it's going 12 months a year. So there's rarely a calm enough time to integrate. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's never a good time in an accounting firm, right? You always
Yeah.
have a deadline, but especially within CAS, because we always say, it's uh, we don't have the highs and lows that tax and audit does. We're just consistently busy, other than like December, January, which is like the biggest. But you know, firms, large firms, they just struggled to standardize at the speed and scale in which they're acquiring firms, right? And so that just makes it hard. So you have firms that are acquiring, every month, every couple months. And so you're trying to bring all of these new firms on board and show them the way. But what we find though, too, is that the onboarding of that becomes just more firm centric and not like, here's how we operate in CAS, right? And so now your autonomy is often, promised during like that deal negotiation, but that doesn't translate into real integration and what that plan is. So firms need more of that from a day one, like a day one roadmap, day one, like no, just defining what that success looks like.
I said at the very beginning that oftentimes when firms think that they're acquiring a CAS practice, it's a write-up practice. So when that happens, how can a firm bifurcate CAS from write-up?
Well, and again, as this relates to, are we setting up our CAS leaders for success, right?
Right.
Because
Hmm.
again, a lot of firms think that they're buying a CAS practice, and in fact, they're buying a write up practice. But then what ends up happening is when that firm comes into the acquirer, now that business line tends to fall with that CAS leader, right? And that's the write up work, as we all know, is pure, just high level, simple definition, is the work's being done for the core purpose of completing the tax return, right? That work isn't consistent. It's not on a monthly basis. There's not a standard fixed fee. Technology isn't integrated. So that write up work is generally done also for small fees. Like, I mean, we see a lot with firms where it's just a couple $100, whenever they bill it. So the amount of these clients, though, too, are substantial, like hundreds and sometimes thousands of these clients that are feeding into that tax department. So this clearly isn't the CAS model, right? The CAS model is exactly opposite of that. High fixed fees, highly leveraged with technology, requiring um, a different team skill set and the ability to staff and manage a monthly book of business, which aren't hundreds of clients, depending on firm size, but it's generally not hundreds of clients. So when the acquired firms are generally running a successful CAS practice, right, and CAS teams, and they again inevitably have to take this work under them. But that's the expectation of the CAS leader, and so then that just ends up meaning that they're running two separate practices, right? And so that just doesn't work. This rarely works in addition to workflow flows, fees, service offerings, when CAS leaders are asked to run this write up practice inside of tax and build an advisory engine. They're also running different departments, different offices, different teams with different processes and economics. And so this just dilutes that CAS model and stalls that advisory scalability, is what we find. So then they just don't know where to focus. So then the focus comes almost off of CAS as well.
So, what do you suggest in these cases?
Well, what Michelle and I did, and what we often recommend, is to consider bifurcating those business lines. Leave the write up work, leave the team that's supporting that with the tax department, right? They keep the revenue, they keep the management of the people, they keep the clients. But also in that, identify if there are any team members or clients that can be moved to CAS. Um, and the reason why this worked for us is because, a lot of that tax work was cleanup work, and so it would come in quarterly, it would come in annually, and we'd have a full monthly book of business, and then we would get slammed with all of this work that we didn't honestly have time for, we didn't have capacity for, and it just didn't feel good, right? It didn't feel good to us, it didn't feel good to the tax team, and so we felt like we were failing on both sides of that. So bifurcating this really does, I think, help, but this requires a a bigger plan, right? Because if you are going to convert any clients, um, you're likely going to have that fee discussion and move them to a fixed fee, right? To create those efficiencies and implement that technology. And that fee discussion and the repapering process takes time, right? That's not overnight. That could be 60, 90 days. If there's staff that want to move too, a plan needs to be put in place to say who's going to cover the work that they were doing in that write up team. Who's going to get them up to, how long is it going to take to get them up to speed, and who's going to get them up to speed to learn the as processes. And then also that technology training, that's a learning curve as well. So all of this takes time, and firms need to understand that this moment in time of this transition could also maybe look or feel like a lull. And I just don't know that firms give these CAS teams and leaders just that grace period to say, okay, we need to reset. So
Let's move on to marketing, content, business development. You've said often that the CAS part of the firm often can be thought of last. They sort of come in last in a lot of these areas, um, just basically an afterthought. So, what's the problem you're seeing where marketing, content, business development are concerned?
Yeah, we see this a lot with firms and, whatever we've experienced personally as well. But it's just, firms tend to, um, and when I say firms, I'm saying like the marketing content tends to get repurposed from the audit or tax material and assume it's going to work for the CAS team and CAS service offerings. And it's, again, vastly different. But like, and maybe this is just my perception, and maybe this isn't reality, and I'd love for people to comment on this too. But I just don't know that CAS teams are feeling like they're getting dedicated resources or time.
They're not. I'm hearing the same thing. I hear the same thing over and over. They do not feel like they're getting those dedicated resources and time.
Right, which then becomes part of that support that we were talking about, right, in the
Right.
prior podcast. And so what CAS leaders end up doing, and what we end up helping CAS leaders do too, is they end up branding their own material, right? Which is just, it doesn't make sense. Like, okay, so firm brand needs, has a brand, and that needs to be aligned. And, when I'm trying to brand something, I'm saying to the teams, I'm saying to myself, I'm an accountant. You don't want me creating anything that requires marketing or any creativity skills that I do not possess.
Right.
Right? But I also know that these marketing teams are stretched so thin. So again, this isn't where I really don't want anyone to think I'm placing blame on anybody or a firm or a specific team. It's just the reality of how stretched thin these teams are, right? And so that it just starts to impact the CAS team. So, and that includes, website language, SEO language, proposal decks, one pagers, pricing sheets, um, case studies. So these are all needed though to scale a CAS practice. But it also sends negative signals to CAS leaders in the teams that maybe like first CAS isn't a first class service model. And second, like there's not a consistent message for the partners to use. But again, this is going to what I feel falls into that support bucket.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying and what I've heard other cast experts say is that one, marketing has to own a content lane, right? Provide those dedicated site pages, decks, one pagers, and then even do a quarterly refresh because we know information changes. That should not be on the cast team to do that. Cast leaders can supply the message and the proof, and then marketing builds out the assets for everyone. So no more having leaders DIYing the brand, which can become a hot mess really, really quickly. And then website presence is non-negotiable. If you don't have a dedicated cast page, that's a problem.
Right. Totally. And this also just flows straight into business development for firms. Like if you have firms that have a separate team and a separate, business development team, those CAS leaders need to be present in leading those prospect calls. Again, this is all within reason, right? If it's a co-presentation with tax, obviously we understand that. But if it's when it comes to the CAS selling aspect, the CAS leaders need to be on all of these, and the business development team needs to be on them as well to learn what the CAS offerings are, and how they'll will the partners, then tax partner that's on the call, also better understand what the CAS leaders are doing and selling and what their service offerings are. Because a lot of times in those business development calls, we're always just faced with the client's problems, right? Here's what we
Right.
don't have, here's what we're struggling with. And so CAS is all about problem solving. And I think that I just want to make sure that firms understand that the CAS leaders need to be on every single prospect call.
Agreed. Agreed. Now let's talk tech because this is a big one. Why do approval cycles stall CAS? And what should firms consider instead where tech is concerned?
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I sound like a broken record when I say this all the time, and how vastly CAS is different from audit and tax, but it's, I think, the biggest difference is in this tech realm, right? Because
I
for the
agree.
most part, firms have been using the same audit and tax software for the last 20 years, right? And now insert CAS, we're coming to IT teams with like 10 different products. And to be honest, they're generally annoyed with us. Like that's my my perception. Um, but a traditional tech approvals were not designed for those constant changes and that volume of technology. And so, when we have new products in CAS, it's just a slow approval process. It's a slow adoption, is what we're seeing. And so, oftentimes, by the time a tech product or a tool is approved, the market's already moved on and integrations have changed and now you're still behind the curve because it took so long to get that approved. So I'm not saying also too that the goal isn't just to adopt every shiny new object. I'm not saying that, but it is the goal has to be to move at a CAS pace within those guardrails in order to stay even relevant, I think.
But I think it's a vicious cycle getting caught up in that tech approval process. So, really, what's some practical advice to get people down the road faster to tech approvals decisions?
Yeah. So firms, I think, and we did this too, but stand up like a CAS tech council to where, you have the CAS leader, you have an IT member, maybe an executive partner, and you have a process and a time frame in which you evaluate and approve, like 30 days, right? Don't make it more than that to approve a process that a product can move forward with a deeper analysis. Then, what we recommend with all firms is to then work with IT to identify what do they need? What are their requirements to mitigate risk? Right? What's that security checklist for them that's going to make it easier when we're talking to these vendors to say, you know what, our IT needs this. That could include like single sign-on, MFA, that could be SOC 2 audit reports, like have all of those processes in place. Um, in addition to that, though, because now we're getting into a little bit of that IT governance of data retention, admin roles, provisioning, deprovisioning, and understanding that there are two types of clients within firms. When you are provisioning, deprovisioning, you have your external clients, which are your actual clients, but then you have your
Yeah.
internal clients, which are the CAS team, right? And your IT department doesn't want to deal with that, but they also need to understand what those guardrails and just that security protocol is in place for your CAS teams to be able to just do that without having to go through them for everything as well.
I
Um,
just
Go ahead. Sorry.
I just say just avoid jumping through all those hoops because there are a lot of hoops in some firms.
Exactly. Another thing for firms to do is just to identify like what those tiered tech stacks are. Obviously, you have your core stack, right? Like what's absolutely necessary for us to run a CAS practice, your GL platforms, AP, bank feeds, all of just the basic. Then your next tier could be like, what are those, third party apps that are add-ons and what's that approval process going to look like, inventory, multi-entity, FP&A, cash flow reporting, all of those things. And these are all needed to upskill into advisory and needed for CAS teams to create those efficiencies and to increase margins, right? This is how you have those fixed fees, you're increasing your margins. But at this point of life in CAS, if the teams are doing any of these things manually, the business line that it's not scaling and it's not sustainable. So when we can't get tech approved, what we end up doing is just adding people, right? We just add people when it's not necessary. So now we're adding larger costs and we're kind of throwing people at the problem. But because some of the firms just make it so difficult to allow CAS teams to adopt and implement tech, this is sometimes their only option, which is obviously not optimal. And so teams also need to understand that they're, um, the the magnitude of this. In addition, also explaining to the firm and to tech teams that there's multiple products and multiple products for just one, accounts payable or spend management, right? And so it doesn't mean like, oh, we need to adopt this product and therefore we're going to get rid of this product. Sometimes that happens, but when you're onboarding these CAS clients, you're generally allowing them to, within reason, obviously not a ton, but within reason, let them bring their products unless there's a reason to move them to a different product. So it's just a different mindset. But I know
I
we
think
drive
talking
use crazy. We do.
That's okay. Sometimes you gotta say things over and over and over and over again, right? That's how you break traditional models and move into a more, modern methodology, which is what we need for CAS practices. And I think talking about tech, the next logical segue is into standardization. So, what do you have to say about standardization? We know it's not optional. It's a must.
It's a must. And this is where, like, when we say, "Are your CAS leaders set up for success?" If there's not a standardization and if there's not a mandate for that, that all managers and all teams need to do everything one way, and if we allow managers to do it their own way. Now you have
Yeah.
staff saying, and this did happen with us for a while too, but now we have staff saying, "Well, this is how Christine does this and wants to see this, and this is how Michelle does this and wants to see that." That doesn't scale, right? Every office, every team ends up selling, a slightly different product with that too. Our service offerings are a little different, so that partner level mandate needs to be. Um, an absolute and not just like a polite suggestion, right? Because that's just not how you scale.
So just to reiterate, you didn't use the term CAS playbook, but that's how you standardize is by running by a playbook. So everyone is not supporting clients in a different way. That's just not profitable. So managing partners should mandate that CAS playbook and the CAS leader should enforce it.
Right. And
Yeah.
and this playbook, I think where firms get tripped up a little bit. So, um, in this CAS playbook, and this is how what we help firms do as well, is what's that standardization that any team member, any new hire can just pick up and go, this is exactly how we do this. This is where I save things. This is the file naming convention. These are my steps for a traditional month end close. Here's the close timeline. Here's what this reporting pack looks like. What here's the review checklist that my manager is going to go through, or a manager can pull it up and say, this is what I need to do each month. Again, knowing that we tweak these for every client, but something that's standard. Here's our pricing guardrails. Here's when we know we can have conversations with clients because their volume changed. And what does that clause look like? So when this is written and backed by leadership, then that adoption follows. But what we find and what we see is that it's not being mandated. And so then CAS leaders are struggling to get all of these separate offices and managers to adopt that standardization because it feels optional.
Yeah. So then there has to be a cadence. So that there has to be a cadence in terms of where the executives sit as well, in terms of strategy and meeting and constantly reinforcing and maybe tweaking where needed. So how do CAS leaders keep alignment without constantly having to renegotiate or relitigate, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I think this one is really important too because I think when you hire really um and all these CAS leaders are amazing, but when you hire these competent CAS leaders, I feel like sometimes firms then are like, "Oh, well they've got it," right? And then there's not that continued strategic conversation, direction, what are your hurdles, what are your goals? And so that cadence of that like every whatever it is, monthly meeting that never gets moved, never gets canceled, it just doesn't get missed. They just need access to these executives for decisions, consistent messaging across the partners, across the firm. And it's a strategy piece. And a lot of that strategy needs executive approval and buy in as it relates to various teams and departments within the firm.
And consistency and frequency where oversight is concerned. So, like my really good friend Alan Whitman, who I'm sure you know the name, he says in his book, he says all the time, all roads lead to and from strategy. You can never abandon strategy, which is why the cadence of reviewing and meeting with cast leaders is just it's so important to make sure you're also constantly improving. So what you're saying is firms should have a set cadence, such as what maybe biweekly or monthly strategy with
Yep.
executive team
Yeah.
or?
Right, because
Okay.
and again, like, that strategy is set, but it also changes, right? And so all of
Hmm.
these things come up on a regular basis. So, the meeting topics, they should include decisions, due based on the agreed upon timelines, such as the tech approvals, the pricing exceptions, any staffing moves. Also, risks and hurdles that the cast leader is facing, because those change every day. Integration blockers, security questions, client offboardings, and then also holding though the CAS leader accountable with a scorecard review, right? Because again, we're talking about accountability with what's on that scorecard. Are those on time closes, rework, like template adoption, margin per team, margin by client, so that just that strategic meeting with a set cadence, I can't express how important that is to happen all the time without
Yeah.
exception.
So many factors to consider. Just so many that you talked about in this episode. At what point, like, how do CAS leaders operationalize these ideas? I know that you've got something called the Infinite Advisors Firm Pathway. Like, what does that look like, and how does it help them operationalize?
Yeah, and so just for clarification, um we have infinite advisors and infinite ties, but we have the pathway, which is the more strategic, and that pathway is a 15-point plan for CAS leaders and executive teams to work through. We go through each of those 15 points and we assign people and what do you need? And you CAS leader, can you make this decision on your own? Do you need to bring in marketing? Do you need to bring in your executive team?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot from a
Yeah.
strategic standpoint. And then the playbook, though, is for your CAS teams to follow. So the pathway is strategically, what does that look like? And then with that, assigning what is that the timing of each of those and those plans when we are assigning those owners and tracking the adoption of each of those through a scorecard really across like four different aspects and views like operationally, margin change orders, from a customer perspective and from a people perspective.
So, for everybody listening, can you share exercises they can run this month?
Sure. So have a decision roadmap. That's an easy one, right? List five recurring decisions that you're making on a regular basis. Who should decide? Who like then actually decides? Where does it stall? Where are those bottlenecks, right? And then identify the gaps and close those gaps as much as possible. Then create the tech stack process that we talked about, put those into the tiers, what's missing, what's redundant, what's slow to approve. Then we talked about too, like just run a quick test. We'll call it a bifurcation test, but run a test to identify which clients really truly belong in CAS versus write up. And is there a plan to ever separate those lanes without service disruption? We're not trying to impact the client service on any level. Run through the meeting rehearsal, right? Run have a mock biweekly strategy meeting, with a live decision, say like a tech approval or a client exit. And so practice that discussion in the format that you'll actually use. And then also having that standardization sprint, we'll call it. Pick one standard, if that's a reporting pack or a closed cadence, and set a 30-day adoption target with measurable criteria. And all of these concepts turn into forward motion, turn into scalability. Um, and then just get all of the offices and teams on the same path.
Excellent. So, what's one takeaway you want firm leaders to remember from this episode?
I think though too, just if you're a managing partner or your executive team, ask yourself if your CAS leaders have autonomy, if they're set up for success, if you're tasking them with any of the things that we just went through in this podcast, and what does that look like? And is it impeding um, the CAS growth for the firm? And if you're a CAS leader, identify what you need to be successful, right? That's part of your strategy meetings as well. So set up that immediate meeting to be strategic and build that scalable CAS practice.
Yeah. All good stuff. Thank you, Christine Triantos. Thank you, listeners. Please come back next time for more Cast Gold. And until then, that's our promise to you. And this is fantastic.